Now, in the Gettysburg Address, the first line of the Gettysburg Address is 407 years ago, our forefathers brought upon this continent uh, a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And in my research, the word continent has really jumped out at me. And the reason for that is in the 1860s, the word continent meant the Western Hemisphere. So when politicians, when intellectuals, when newspapers used the word continent, it was very commonly used and designated. It signified the Western Hemisphere. Um, there's the Americas, the New World. I mean, there's a lot of ways to talk about the Western Hemisphere. And what strikes me also is that what you had during the Civil War is the Spanish-speaking republics of the Western Hemisphere became much closer to the United States than they had been before the Civil War and that they were after the Civil War. The Spanish-speaking republics, and remember, I'm talking about Peru now and Chile and Colombia, um, they had kicked out Spain in 1821, and they had been very, very critical of the United States before the Civil War for reasons that are pretty obvious. First of all, the United States was extremely avaricious. The U.S. captures 55% of Mexico. Okay, well, that's all really you need to know. And also, many of the Spanish-speaking republics felt that the United States before the Civil War wasn't going to stop. It wasn't clear where the U.S. was going to stop. It wasn't clear that the Rio Grande was going to be the ultimate border of the United States. That it might go even further, especially slaveholding interests, right? As I've talked about earlier in the semester, they're desperate to expand into Cuba, into northern Mexico, into Central America. Who knows where they would have stopped? The other thing is that Spanish-speaking republics, and I think this is really significant, and this is something else that U.S. historians really don't talk about much, they had all ended slavery pretty quickly after they kicked the Spanish out of their countries. Most notably, Mexico, right across the Rio Grande, it had ended slavery in 1829. And as I tell my Texas history students, and I'm not sure I've said it in this class, but it really can't be said enough, nobody died when Mexico ended slavery. Compare that to the United States, where 700,000 people died in a fight that ultimately became about emancipation. Uh, the thing is that by the late 1820s, chattel slavery, the kind that you had in the U.S., was just not a significant institution in Mexico. And to be fair, or I don't know, to be more accurate, maybe is a better word, there were other forms of coerced or unfree labor in Mexico, especially debt peonage, which was really a very, very coercive form of labor. So it's not like Mexico, its hands are completely free, but at least and significantly, Mexico ended chattel slavery, which had begun in the early 1500s, the forcing of captives from Africa into Mexico. Mexico just ended it. And so in the 1840s and 50s, many of these Spanish-speaking republics, when they looked at the United States, they were appalled by slavery and by the continuation of chattel slavery in the United States. And they refused to see the U.S. as a sister republic. Now, again, there's other reasons for this, most notably American expansionism, but also this continuation of slavery at a time when the Spanish-speaking republics in the hemisphere had ended slavery. Now, let me stop and give a quick digression here. Almost every republic that existed in the 1860s. Every form of democratic government that existed in the 1860s existed in the Western Hemisphere, with some very tiny exceptions in Europe. So the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, the New World, whatever you want to call it, was the home of democracy, was the seat of democracy on the globe. Now, many of these democracies were imperfect and they were troubled, as was the United States. But nonetheless, this is where the Western Hemisphere was where democratic government existed. And what you have during the Civil War is, first of all, the South leaves the Union, and of course, the South has a commitment to slavery. And the Spanish-speaking republics in the Western Hemisphere will have nothing to do with the Confederacy. They don't recognize the Confederacy. Mexico, the Confederacy sends a diplomat to Mexico City. It doesn't ask for much, but it does ask for kind of an informal alliance between Mexico and the Confederacy, and Juarez just will not deal with the Confederate government at all. In fact, he ends up kicking out the Confederate diplomat from Mexico City. The person, a guy by the name of Pickett, it's not the guy from Pickett's Charge, it's another Pickett. He just turned out to be a disaster. He got into fights. He wrote letters saying the Confederacy should invade Mexico. He was a complete disaster. So what I'm getting at is the Confederacy was completely isolated within the Western Hemisphere. No other republic, no Spanish-speaking republic would recognize it or would work with it. But on the other hand, these Spanish-speaking republics became very sympathetic to the Union cause. And they aligned themselves with the Union cause, with Abraham Lincoln. Public opinion in the Western Hemisphere, especially in the Spanish-speaking democracies, and the reason I keep saying Spanish-speaking democracies is, if you know anything about the history of Latin America and South America, Brazil is Portuguese. It has its own story. It had even its own king. In the 1860s. I'm going to compartmentalize Brazil from this lecture because I want to talk about the democratic forms of government. And at this point, Brazil, which is a slave-owning society, is a kingship. But the Spanish-speaking democracies in the hemisphere become surprisingly close and surprisingly supportive of the Union. Especially after Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This had been one of the real stumbling blocks between the Spanish-speaking republics and the United States, the continuation of slavery. Well, after January 1st, 1863, slavery is no longer the policy in the United States. In fact, the Civil War has become a war of liberation for African Americans. And so the public opinion in the Spanish-speaking republics in Mexico, Central America, and South America becomes very, very favorable to the Lincoln administration, and significantly very unfavorable to the Confederacy. During the Civil War, the Confederacy does not have one friend among the democracies of the New World. They won't recognize the Confederacy. They won't work with the Confederacy. They won't create any kind of alliances with the Confederacy. And what really strikes me is how isolated the Confederacy is during the Civil War in the Americas. It has the only real friend it has in the Americas is Brazil. But even that disappoints the Confederates. The Confederates thought that Brazil would create a very, very close alliance with the Confederacy because Brazil was slaveholding society run by a king. But King Dom Pedro, the king of Brazil, he's a very, very cautious man. And he's willing to have some trade with the Confederacy, but he refuses to recognize the Confederacy. And so the alliance between Brazil and the Confederacy never lives up to the expectations that the Confederates had before the Civil War. So what's very, very striking to me is how isolated the Confederacy is in the Americas because of its commitment to slavery. Whereas conversely, for a moment anyway, and it's probably in all of history since 1776, when the British were kicked out of British North America, what became the U.S., in the 1820s, when the Spanish are kicked out of the Western Hemisphere, what you had in the 1860s, especially after Lincoln moves towards emancipation, is a very brief moment of solidarity between the United States and the other and the Spanish-speaking republics of the New World. There's an idea that these are sister republics. And the invasion of Mexico, the French invasion of Mexico, really cements this short-lived alliance. I guess the cement couldn't have been that good because the alliance doesn't last that long. But what you have is a brief moment of solidarity between the United States and the other democracies in the Western Hemisphere during the 1860s, while at the same time, the Spanish-speaking democracies in the hemisphere, including Mexico, turn their back on the Confederacy. It's actually quite isolated hemispherically.